about to publish a 12th, a novel titled The Mayflies.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's my distinguished honor and privilege to introduce this evening Thomas Kennerly Wolfe. Thomas Kennerly Wolfe Jr., to be correct, who broke into the American literary scene in the 1960s, and nothing in fiction has been the same since. Tom Wolfe grew up in Richmond, Virginia, and is a graduate of Washington and Lee University. He has his PhD in American civilization from another respectable institution, Yale University, where the Alumni Association has awarded him the Wilbur Cross Medal. Frequently garbed in white, like a figure from F. Scott Fitzgerald novel, he has carved a unique path in journalism, art, his own art, and fiction. When Tom had to postpone my invitation to be at Brown from last year to this spring, he sent along with his apologia a wonderful line drawing of himself in stocks. It's a collector's item. I'm not going to collect all his letters, I have many of them, for David Winston Bell Gallery show, because it would not do justice to him, because he is so wonderful. Dubbed the father of new journalism by unknown individuals, not himself, Tom Wolfe has been hailed as the most brilliant chronicler of contemporary American social scene by critics and fans alike. A superb prose stylist, storyteller, and entertainer, he has collected awards, bestowed awards upon him from Columbia, the Washington Newspaper Guild, the Society of Magazine Writers, the American Academy of Arts and Letters, the National Culture Society, and many, 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 many others, including plethora of honorary degrees and the John Dos Passos Award. His literary works frequently sport eclectic titles, like The Candy-Colored Tangerine, Flake Streamline Baby in 1965, and Radical Chic and Mao Maoing, The Flag Catchers in 1970, The Right Stuff in 1979, won the American Book Award, and his 1987 book, Bonfire of the Vanities, was on the bestseller list for months, praised for his deadly wit and engaging style. Tom Wolfe I can describe in the following terms. Number one, he's an intellectual, he's a scholar, he's a writer, he's a journalist, but he's a man of integrity, intellectual integrity, and passion. It has been my great honor and delight to have known him since my Texas days and to have welcomed him as a trustee of the New York Public Library, as a literary lion of the New York Public Library, and as a personal friend. And for every cause that I've asked him to appear for, he's done so. Against censorship, on behalf of First Amendment, on behalf of rights of intellectuals to write and writers to disseminate their writings, but more so also on behalf of the book, the libraries. He's a trustee of the New York Public Library. It's been therefore my great privilege that he's taken time off from his book to come all the way from New York to Providence to honor us by giving this evening's lecture. Ladies and gentlemen, the wonderful Tom Wolfe.
Vartan, thank you very, very much. After that, I should do the decent thing and just retire right now. I mean, it's not going to get any better. One thing I can't forgive Brown University for is luring Vartan and Claire away from New York City. The moment they left, the vibrancy, the brilliance, and the general panache of New York dimmed down greatly. So please come back every now and then to poor old Gotham, and give us a little illumination. I'm a little embarrassed by the title of my talk for this evening. I saw it was printed on the sort of advance publicity, the end of the century and the spirit of the age. I kind of remind myself of Sigourney Weaver, who gave the commencement address at my daughter's school in New York. It's an all-girls school. And she said, when I arrived here this morning, my intention was to talk to you girls about boys. She said, but the headmistress informs me I have only 15 minutes, so instead I'm going to tell you the meaning of life. And well, in this case, I feel so ebullient being here in such grand company, and having had a marvelous serving of mashed potatoes at the President's house tonight. I'm going to, in the short time that I have with you, tell you everything that you need to know about the end of the century and the spirit of the age. Now, this term, the spirit of the age, was actually coined by Hegel in the year 1808, I believe. He called it the zeitgeist, a famous term in its own right. John Stuart Mill brought it forth into the 19th century as the spirit of the age in English. And the idea behind this notion of the spirit of the age, which was taken very seriously 100 years ago, was that every age, every historical epoch has its own moral tone, and that no matter how hard you try, you cannot escape the moral tone of the age that you're in. Now, this idea was once the animating force behind major novelists. The great ones took it as part of their natural task to explain the spirit of the age in which they wrote. An excellent example is Thomas Mann in The Magic Mountain. In the first chapter, he introduces us to his main character, Hans Castorp. He's this good-looking, young, well-educated, well-born young man with the world lying before him. In the second chapter, he suddenly turns to us, the readers, and he says, you know, this man I just introduced you to, this Hans Castorp, he's actually a very mediocre fellow. That it's not that he doesn't have a lot going for him, it's not that he doesn't have a great potential, but he happens to live in an age in which, when one asks the question, why? What are we struggling towards? What is this all about? The answer he gets is only a hollow silence. And it is when you live in an epoch like that, it undercuts your morale. It undercuts your potential, so that someone who should end up having a brilliant career ends up as a mediocre man like Hans Castorp. Well, many great American writers have also taken it upon themselves to try to explain the spirit of the age. Our first Nobel Prize winner in literature, Sinclair Lewis, was attempting to explain the spirit of the age in America right after the First World War, when he wrote Babbitt, when he wrote Main Street, Elmer Gantry. Our fifth Nobel laureate for literature, John Steinbeck, was trying to do the same thing about the Great Depression when he wrote The Grapes of Wrath. But in our own time, and really ever since the Second World War, writers have pretty much given up this particular task, not just in the United States, but all across Europe. In the United States, I think the situation was best summed up by Philip Roth at a time when he was the hottest young novelist in America. He had won the National Book Award with Goodbye Columbus. He then lit up the sky with Portnoy's Complaint. And he says, we now live in an age in which the imagination of the novelist is helpless before what he knows he's going to read in tomorrow morning's newspaper. And I think anybody, writer or otherwise, can sympathize with that. I mean, for example, just think of the following little political drama, which 5 years ago could not have been written as fiction. The problem with fiction, I can tell you, having written nonfiction most of my life and then turned to fiction, the problem with fiction is it has to be plausible. That's not true with nonfiction. It's really not true. But fiction has to be plausible. All right, so I'm saying that, 5 years ago, this would not have been plausible. Recently in New York City, there was a primary election, Democratic primary election for city council in the Greenwich Village area of New York. As I say, this little piece of political history is unimportant in itself, but it, I think, dramatizes what I'm talking about. One of the main candidates was the 39-year-old daughter of a famous former New York Congresswoman, Bella Abzug. And when she announced her candidacy, the daughter, for this position, the major plank in her platform was her statement, her announcement really, I am a lesbian. Her main opponent, a man named Thomas Duane, countered by saying there's something awfully fishy about this. He said, here's a 39-year-old woman born to a prominent New York political family, now telling us all of a sudden that she is a lesbian. This strikes me as an awfully recent conversion and a rather blatant bid for popularity. Whereas I have been openly gay for more than 7 years. I have made absolutely no bones about this, to which she said, yes, that may be true, but I am doubly stigmatized. First, I'm a woman. Second, my orientation is homosexual. To which he said, yes, but I am HIV positive. At this point, the third candidate in this primary election said, under the circumstances, I have no choice but to come forward and to declare openly, yes, it's true, I'm heterosexual, but I guarantee to the voters of this district, this will not influence me in any way in the public performance of my duties. Now, as I say, this would not have been a plausible scenario in most cities in this country 5 years ago. Now, it's perfectly plausible in most of the major cities of this country. This also, I think, shows immediately a little bit of what I'm talking about, the change in the moral tone of the country. In any case, you can, I think, sympathize with Philip Roth's lament. It is extremely difficult for the imagination of novelists to keep up with what happens so fast in this country today. At the same time, this means that we no longer have, however, the Anton Chekhovs to tell us about our own fin de siècle. This term, fin de siècle, of course, literally means nothing more than end of the century. But in Europe 100 years ago, it had a much more profound meaning. It referred to a kind of unearthly feeling that the very, tectates, plates of the earth were shifting under European civilization. Something very strange and troubling was happening. And this phrase, fin de siècle, seemed to sum it up. Chekhov wrote almost exactly 100 years ago a wonderful, long, short story, almost a novella, called A Woman's Kingdom, which opens with a 24-year-old woman having just inherited a factory from her uncle who has just died. She's having a meeting with her closest confidant, a lawyer, in this small town where they live. And she's saying to him, I don't want a factory. I don't want to be the proprietress of an industrial enterprise. I'm 24 years old. I'm still a young woman. I want to live as a woman. I want to give it away. I'm going to give this factory to somebody. I'm going to give it away. To which the lawyer says, please, use your head. Be sensible. Instead of giving it away, keep your wealth. Take a lover. Take 7 lovers, one for each day of the week. To which she says, please spare me your fin de siècle decadence. These two terms, fin de siècle, the end of the century, and decadence, were closely intertwined at that time. People thought about this notion constantly. Both Marx and Nietzsche referred to the end of the last century as a decadent period. If it was decadent, what was it that was decaying? Of course, we're talking about Europe now. What was decaying were moral codes. And this gave rise to what is probably the most famous statement in all of modern philosophy, which is Nietzsche's statement that God is dead. That was his attempt to explain what was happening at the end of the last century. Of course, by that statement, he was not making a declaration of atheism. As he put it, I am bringing the news. I am describing the greatest event of modern history. And that great event, in his terminology, was the slaying of God by educated people no longer believing in God. It is such a profound thing. It's hard to realize that until the 19th century, there were no philosophers who did not believe in God. We don't think about Plato and Aristotle believing in God, but they always posited the existence of a God. Even Hume finally says, well, there must be one somewhere to just make the whole system to make the whole system work. But this idea that educated people were no longer believing in God was dynamite. Now, along with the statement, which he said, this great event, the news that I bring you, he made 3 predictions. The first one was, in the 20th century, because of the death of God, or this collapse of belief is what we're talking about, he said, there will be wars such as have never been waged on earth before, wars catastrophic beyond all imagining. Now, whatever else you may think of Nietzsche, just consider that for a second as a prediction made in 1888, before atomic bombs were created or anything else. Not a bad prediction to have made in the year 1888. His reasoning was this. He said, you have killed God, you no longer believe in God, but you have not killed guilt. And guilt is implanted in human beings very early in life, long before the age of reason. So you will now be sort of like the headless body of a religion. There'll be guilt everywhere, no way to absolve it. You'll have no one to turn to absolve your guilt, expiate your sins. As a result, you're going to loathe not only one another, you're going to loathe yourselves. And said, and furthermore, you're going to be seized with an implacable, ever-mounting skepticism. Things that you accepted just as a matter of course as truth, beauty, and eternal verities, you will now see as cheap lies, as sublimated lust and greed, and as hypocrisies that have been contrived to cover up cynical strategies of power. And that also not a bad prediction to have been made in the year 1888. And he said, and that will be the easy century, the 20th. He said, wait till the 21st. He said, you will see horrors beyond even your wildest imagination. I'll get to those predictions in just a second about the 21st. At the same time, a contemporary of Nietzsche's, Max Weber, the great sociologist who gave us the term the Protestant ethic, the work ethic, also the term status, as in status seeking, said Nietzsche is correct, and in the 20th century, art will replace religion, aesthetics will replace ethics as the standard by which educated people judge one another. And just think for a moment the degree to which that has come true in our country in our own time. When Weber came to this country in 1904, at the time of the St. Louis World's Fair, he made a tour of the South and the Middle West, and he said, the United States is the most religious country I have ever laid eyes on. He said, anybody who aspires to the eminence of assistant manager of the feed store or better very ostentatiously joins the leading Protestant denomination in the town in which he lives, if he possibly can. Just compare that to our situation today. I'm not saying that there aren't business leaders in the United States who are religious. I'm not saying there are none who are on the board of deacons or whatever the equivalent may be in other churches or religions. But this is not the way you pray in public if you're an American business leader today. You keep it pretty quiet. If you want to show your spiritual worthiness, what is it that you want to be known as a member of today? The museum board. Being on the board of the art museum is what shows your spiritual worthiness. And what has replaced the St. Patrick's cathedrals and all the other great churches as centers of spiritual worthiness in this country today? Well, it's things like the Chandler Pavilion in Los Angeles, Lincoln Center in New York. It's art and culture have surely enough done this. I don't know how many of you happened to see the Vatican art exhibit that came through the country just a few years back. This was called the Art Treasures of the Vatican. It was the great paintings and sculptures of the Vatican's own collection. It came to this country, went all the way across the country. When it reached New York City, naturally it was a major New York art world event. Every major New York art world figure was invited to this great dinner on the apron of the Temple of Dinder at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. That's this strange, shrunken Egyptian temple under glass at the Metropolitan. But since this was the Vatican's collection, it was necessary also to invite leading Roman Catholics, starting with the cardinal on down to prominent Roman Catholic laymen. And in arranging the seating at the tables, there were these round tables out on the apron of the Temple of Dender, they used what I would call the Arapaho bead design. Here's one art world luminary, one Roman Catholic, one art world luminary, all around these tables. There must have been 20 or 30 tables. This was the most silent public dinner I've ever attended in my life. All you could hear all night long was the ping of hotel silver off the off the earthenware from the caterers as it ricocheted off the facade of the Temple of Dender. After the main course, before the dessert, I happened to be out in the lobby of the Metropolitan, and here came two very well-known New York art world figures, both of them gallery owners, both of them wearing their tuxedos. And I heard one of them say to the other, "Who in the name of God are these unbelievable people?" Well, of course, he's talking about the Roman Catholics. The idea was, what are these pagans, these heathens doing at a major New York art world event? I mean, that's how far this idea of art as the center of spiritual worthiness had finally come. But now, why should this prediction made by a German against the backdrop of decadence in Europe and the sort of the troubling side of the fin de siècle in Europe come true in the United States in our time? And after all, 100 years ago, when all these predictions and philosophical analyses were being made, the United States was anything but a decadent country. We were a young, robust country, naive, innocent in the very best sense of those words, a young, mighty country about to take its place on the world stage with the arrival of the First World War. I think the answer to why these predictions came true here has to do with what I consider the most neglected part of contemporary American history. I'm thinking of the intellectual history of this country, particularly since the First World War. It was just after the war that American artists, writers, scholars, the people that we now rather loosely pull together under the umbrella of intellectuals, had their chance to see European intellectuals and European intellectual life up close. And at that time, after the First World War, there was something irresistible about the picture of the European intellectual, this glistening figure, standing aloof from the rubble of European civilization, pointing to the cinders and saying, that's what the decadence of a civilization brings you, utter ruin. And of course, there was a certain logic to this. There were no winners of the First World War in Europe. It was in many ways the destruction of a civilization. Well, this stance became irresistible to American writers, artists, intellectuals in general. And it is starting with the First World War, with very few exceptions of something like a magazine called Masses, which was an early Marxist publication. You find suddenly this tremendous skepticism that Nietzsche prophesied taking hold among American intellectuals. It's at that point that suddenly you have an H.L. Mencken, who coins the term bourgeoisie to describe the American middle class, who describes the American South as the Sahara of the Beaux-Arts. It's then that you have a Sherwood Anderson, who writes of Winesburg, Ohio, which was the prototype of every work since then, like Peyton Place or anything else you can imagine, that tells you that underneath the veneer of small-town life in America is absolute rot and decadence. And that was the problem, you see. We didn't have any rubble, any cinders for our best minds to point to. This country had scarcely been touched, really, by certainly not at home, by the First World War. So the stance became, well, but if you just pull back the covers a little bit from this mom's pie, rosy-cheeked, seemingly innocent civilization, you'll see the rot and decadence that exists underneath. And of course, that's what Sinclair Lewis, whom I admire extravagantly, made a career of, was pulling back the covers from this seemingly rosy civilization and pointing out the rot underneath. It was also an example, an illumination of Nietzsche's prophecy, of the gathering gloom skepticism, and as Nietzsche would have it, of nihilism, in which, since you no longer believe in a God, you can no longer believe that God ordained anything. There's no more justification of anything. Almost everything becomes an arrangement in terms of power or greed. Now, this stance, this intellectual stance, has really never changed over the past 70-odd years. And so that we find ourselves, I think, right now in a very much an anomalous situation. In objective terms, this has been very much the American century. I'm not the first person to say that, but everyone who said it has been correct. Since the Second World War, certainly, this has been the century in which the United States becomes the most powerful military force in all of history. It's the century in which we develop the capacity to blow up the entire planet by turning a couple of cylindrical keys in a missile silo. But at the same time, we also developed a means to escape to the stars on spaceships if we happen to blow the whole things to smithereens. I mean, to me, it's amazing to know that we're alive in the first epoch of all times in which it's possible to break the bonds of Earth's gravity and fly in spaceships and try to discover and make sense of the rest of the universe. But quite beyond any of these great historic or technical phenomena, it's also the century in which the United States developed an affluence, which finally reached down to the level of mechanics and tradesmen to an extent that would have made the Sun King blink. So that you can be sure that tonight, as we meet here in Providence, that your electrician, or your air conditioning mechanic, or your burglar alarm repairman is right now in Puerto Vallarta, or St. Kitts, or Barbados, and he's there with his third wife. Along about now, the two of them are on the terrace of a resort hotel in one of these marvelous places. He's wearing his Harry Belafonte cane cutter shirt open down to the sternum, the better to reveal the play of light and shadow of the gold chains that are twinkling in his chest hairs. If I'm not terribly wide of the mark, I'm sure that the two of them have just ordered a little Kibel sparkling water, because things like Perrier and San Pellegrino are so old hat by now. They're so tame. This has been, in terms of the affluence of almost, I do not deceive myself, but of almost a whole people, there's been absolutely nothing like this in all of history. This objective power, this objective wealth, this sort of unassailable standing in which you have a nation that is now the only superpower in the world, has not measurably altered the opinion of our best minds, I would not say. One still hears highly respected, very intelligent, and greatly talented artists and writers talk about the threat of fascism in America. I mean, just think of recently the cartoons, the descriptions, the references to people like Newt Gingrich. I don't know how many times I've seen Newt Gingrich with his white hair and a little black mustache coming down underneath his nose, or Lynn Cheney compared to Joseph Goebbels, the Nazi propaganda minister. I mean, these people may have their shortcomings, but these references are to Nazi Germany we're talking about. And it's the eternal descent of the dark night of fascism in America, an idea that simply will not be given up. No, writers will not let go of this. This so intrigues Jean-Francois Revel, the French philosopher and socialist, by the way. He ran for the Chamber of Deputies on the socialist ticket, to come to this country because he wanted to be on hand when this cataclysmic event, the descent of the dark night of fascism, occurred. He toured the United States, went to many college campuses, incidentally, returned to France. He wrote a book called Neither Marx Nor Jesus, in which he said, the dark night, in the United States, he said, I ran across one of the most puzzling phenomena in all of astronomy. He said, the dark night of fascism is always descending in America, but it only touches Earth and Europe. He says it's a very puzzling thing. Well, he explained it in the following way. He said, in the United States, the most important ideas in the intellectual world have come from out of what he called a Marxist mist. He said there are very few Marxists in the United States, and I think he's absolutely right about that. He said, but many of the major ideas have come from out of a vague Marxist notion of the inequalities of the class struggle, such as the idea of the imminent descent of the dark night of fascism. Now, if I have been correct in trying to sketch out these two main forces that have had such an effect on our own time, first of all, this tremendous affluence, which really began about 1943 as the Second World War began to take this country out of the Great Depression of the 30s. It lasted really until about 1991 when the Gulf War finally brought an end, or the aftermath of the Gulf War brought an end to this tremendous upward surge of the economy. Right now we're in what you could call a recession, a trough, and probably beginning to climb out of it. The other thing, the other great vector, the great force, is this skepticism, the very skepticism that Nietzsche prophesied so long ago, the skepticism of our very best minds. And the French have a saying, skepticism soon hardens into contempt. And I think that notion also applies. And perhaps Nietzsche was not far off the mark either in prophesying a kind of universal nihilism among educated people. Now, in the 1990s, right now, these two forces converge to create a common result. On the one hand, we've had this tremendous wealth and affluence, rising prosperity, for almost 50 years it lasted, which means that 2 generations of Americans have grown up without any personal memory of the downside of economic cycles, the capacity for ruin that economic cycles bring. Some have had a bit of a taste of it since 1991, but it has not been anything like the Great Depression of the 1930s. So this lends a sense of immunity. At the same time, if your very best minds in a society, the great writers, the great philosophers, the great scholars, are telling you that these old standards are in the main bourgeois superstitions that have no intrinsic meaning or value. This is like a double permission slip that will enable you, make you feel entitled to sweep aside standards that have been in place in many cases for millennia. And I think that's exactly what has been occurring in this country, particularly in the last 35 years. And I do not exempt myself from any of this, as I'll tell you in just a moment. Some of the sweeping aside of standards has been very blatant. But some of it has been, I think, rather subtle. And one of the more subtle examples, I think, is the changing attitude towards debt. I was raised being told that to get seriously into debt was not only inadvisable, it was immoral. It showed that you could not rein in your appetite for immediate gratification. You had to have it all now. Well, along about 1970, I started hearing this word leverage. And I had never heard this word used in an economic or financial sense before. And I said, what are you talking about? And people started saying, you've got to get into debt. It's the only way to live now. You've got to get into debt up to your eyebrows if you can possibly manage to do it. Somehow debt was a lever that moved the world. And under the existing tax codes of that time, there was a certain rationale to all of this. And I soon found myself getting into the swing of this thing, which is not a very advisable thing for a freelance writer to do, I assure you. And one night I'll never forget, in Dallas, Texas, I was sitting next to a gentleman I'd never met before. He suddenly turns to me and he says, son, I got to tell you something. So I went down to the bank today, I borrowed me $1.8 million, personal loan, nothing to do with my company. He said, what do you think of that? I turned to him and I suddenly heard myself saying, that's great. No, that's terrific. And the awful thing is it came from my heart. I was genuinely impressed, even moved by the fact that I was sitting next to a man who had borrowed $1.8 million. If he had told me, son, I made $1.8 million today, I would have tried to act interested. you know, try not to yawn in his face, but had borrowed 1.8. That was the spirit of the times. That was the spirit of that age. You know, leverage. That was everything. The amazing thing is that has not died. That attitude has not changed, even despite the recession or trough that began in 1991, and which continues. The book that I'm trying desperately to finish now has a lot to do with real estate developers, and I've been in the company of a lot of real estate developers over the last couple of years, and their attitude is, you know, if you're not in Chapter 7 or Chapter 9 or Chapter 11 or some other chapter of the bankruptcy code, you just weren't a player in the 80s. You know, you weren't willing to take a risk. You just weren't a gambler. It is a different world. I think that's a rather subtle change, this attitude towards death. But now, I won't go through all the blatant major changes, but I must mention one. I mean, there's no way you cannot mention this. I'm talking about what is generally called the sexual revolution. I personally think that's a rather prim term for the lurid carnival that has taken place over the past 35 to 40 years. Nevertheless, that's what it's usually called, the sexual revolution. And I think anybody in a university setting today has a very close look at what I'm talking about. You know, even 25 years ago, certainly 30 years ago, if anyone, any public figure, let's say, had come forward and said there should be in this country an institution known as the co-ed dorm, in which downy, nubile young things and young men in the season of the rising sap would live together, not only in the same buildings, not only along the same corridors, but might even share bathrooms together. Such an individual would have been looked at as if you know, he had weevils eating his eyebrows or something. It was an unthinkable proposition just 25 years. And today, it's like I-95. You know, it's the co-ed, you know, it's big, it's there, there's an occasional hum, but that, I mean, nobody really pays any attention to it. And nevertheless, this is an enormous change in a society, particularly one, as Max Weber pointed out, as religious as this one has historically been. The other, just one other example of the sexual revolution, a very recent one, really a kind of latest kink in the sexual revolution, is what is known as the custom of the, or institution of the trophy wife. Now, I have sometimes been credited with coining that term, the trophy wife. It's not true. It was coined by Fortune magazine in a brilliant piece not that long ago, in which Fortune stated quite correctly that one of the standard perks for a chief executive officer of a corporation today, a successful corporate leader, is the right, universally recognized, to shuck his old wife of 2 to 3 decades standing and to get a new wife, a trophy wife, preferably in her 20s, preferably blonde, as in the phrase that comes from somewhere, the lemon tart. And once he has done this, you know, once he has found a needlepoint shop for his old wife to run so she can sell yarn to her friends, and he's taken on the new trophy wife. What is the downside for him when he's done this? What is the downside? Is he suddenly, is the new couple suddenly socially radioactive? You know, are they personae non gratae at this point? Do people whisper sotto voce behind the hand when they come by? Oh, of course not. You know what happens, and I know what happens. Everyone gets on the telephone to try to get the spelling of the new wife's first name, because it's always something like Serena, and no one knows how to spell it. And once that's recorded in this little Scully and Scully red leather address book, that's the end of it. Then life goes on. And that's what intrigued me. Now this, as I say, this piece was brilliant, original, and I just only want to add one footnote to it, a minor footnote. It's my sole contribution to the entire theory. There was no mention in this piece, in Fortune, of the mating rituals of the CEO of the corporation and this lemon tart, the trophy wife. And I happen to have been present on many occasions at these mating rituals. In fact, that's what intrigued me most about the late discotheque era of American nightlife, the era of places like Xenon and Studio 54 and the Palladium and all those places. It was the sight out on the discotheque floor of the 57-year-old CEO of the corporation with his trophy wife-to-be. They're not married yet. This is the courtship. He would be out there in his navy blue, chalk stripe, hard-finish worsted suit. He'd have on a medium spread collar white shirt from F.R. Tripler and Company, shepherd's check necktie. He'd have his hair combed back over his ears in little sloops and what's known as the 57th Street Biggie haircut. His trophy wife-to-be, the lemon tart, would be out there in front of him, and she'd be wearing, something like a pair of Everlast boxing trunks. She'd have on a man's strap-style undershirt. Her hair would look as if a snapper lawnmower ran over it. This was known as the war waif coiffure. And he would be beaming at her with these red eyes through these walnut shell eyelids. He'd be breathing stertorously, desperately trying to do the robot or the eel or the sadomaso until the onset of dawn, saline depletion, or myocardial infarction, whichever came first. And after all, you know, why shouldn't he? Because what are Mom and the Cutlass Sierra and Buddy and Sis up against a love like this? That first night on the disco floor, she wore a pair of boxing trunks, while leather punks and painted Lulus, African queens and Sado Zulus paid her court. I grow old the 1990s way, deaf, but from a Max Q octophonic beat, stroked out, but on my own 2 feet, disco macho for you, my new cookie. Now, I insist that this little kink in the mores of a country as historically religious as this country is no small thing, and it could not have occurred, it could not have happened without this tremendous affluence that I've been talking about. You know, after all, the average middle-class American divorce today can cost upwards of $100,000 once the various therapists, for the marriage counselors, for the children, for the due parties, the lawyers, and everything is factored in. If it's, you know, if at the CEO level, it's much more. This is a byproduct in so many ways of affluence, but also a byproduct, not to put too heavy a hand on it, of the death of God that Nietzsche was talking about. If there really is no truth, if there's no beauty, if there are no eternal verities, and we are the product of our animal selves, what is there to, what argument can we really mount against it? And we live in a highly statistical era of mathematical analyses, and there are, even now, because there is so many people are troubled by this change in the zeitgeist, this change in the spirit of the age, they're trying to come up with statistical studies to measure what has gone on. This was the motivation behind William Bennett's Index of Leading Americans' Cultural Indicators, which is patterned on the government's leading index of economic indicators, using the Yankelovich polling organization to do much of the statistical work and so on. Bennett, who was, as you will remember, was Secretary of Education under Ronald Reagan and so-called drug czar under George Bush, came up with a lot of interesting statistics, one of which was that since between 1960 and 1990, the rate of illegitimate births in this country rose from 5% in 1960 to 28% in 1990. And as we now know, this surge of illegitimate births, or births out of wedlock, is by no means confined to the slums of the United States. This is something that goes through the white population as well as the non-white population of this country. Census statistics released in the summer of 1994 show that 27% of all children in the United States now live in single-parent homes. That single parent is almost always a woman, and in this case, a woman who has never been married. This is not counting children who live with one parent who has been divorced. Teenage pregnancy The rate of teenage pregnancy since 1960 has risen from statistically 0. Now, granted, it was much harder to hide such things it was much easier and much more customary to hide such things in 1960, but statistically there was no figure. To 10% in 1990. That means of all females in America from ages 13 through 19, 10% will become pregnant out of wedlock. I must confess my own reaction when I read that was, that low? That low? I mean, things have changed so rapidly that I said, well, that's not as discouraging as it, as it might have been. You know, even one of the terms I've just used now is totally anachronistic. I said illegitimate births. I mean, when is the last time you heard that term, illegitimate? You know, when illegitimacy is batting 300, it's not illegitimate any longer. It just isn't. I'll tell you another word probably many people in this room have never heard before, at least not in terms of anything with a stigma attached to it. Cohabitation. That was a term of great opprobrium attached to unmarried males and females who live together. I mean, that's American courtship now. I mean, the greatest point of etiquette facing the parents of college students today is when the son or daughter and the live-in friend come home for the weekend, you put them in the same room or at the opposite ends of the hall, and then, which means you'll never go to sleep all night waiting to hear soft footsteps. This is etiquette, 1996. Now, William Bennett, of course, is a conservative Republican, but David Blankenhorn is a liberal Democrat, originally a Vista volunteer, a follower of Saul Alinsky, who devoted years of his life to trying to organize slum communities to have political power and better themselves. David Blankenhorn has since founded the Institute for American Values. It really began with his work in slum areas of this country in which he said, all right, let's say we get power for these people in the slums. Power for what? Power to do what? Change their lives how? And he quickly came to the conclusion that the most important way in which they could change their lives was in terms of the enforcement of moral codes and of the resurrection of old values that used to exist in slum areas and non-slum areas alike. Hence this Institute for American Values. He has come out with two major studies, both of which were featured on the cover of the Atlantic Monthly in the last few years. One had the rather catchy title of Dan Quayle Was Right, in which this was a highly statistical study showing that single-parent upbringings were filled with the most dreadful hazards and the most discouraging outcomes. The other was one called The Failure of Sex Education in America, which was, I must say, riveting because of the assumptions, which I never knew about what sex education should consist of. For example, apparently one of the staples of sex education in the high schools is the notion that the way to reduce teenage pregnancy is to teach girls ways to bring a young man to fulfillment short of coitus, various techniques for doing this. To their great surprise, this didn't lead to less coitus, but to more. Of course, any unemployed apprentice cedar chopper outside of Austin, Texas could have told you that without a year-long study. But Blankenhorn's findings led him to prophesy in 1993 that the catchphrase for the 1996 presidential election, instead of being "it's the economy, stupid," as it was in 1992, would be "it's the culture, stupid." Blankenhorn was right, but he was right 2 years earlier than he thought. That really was the catchword of the 1994 congressional elections, that tremendous sea change. That was really an election about culture. The Republican Party has not understood that in the years since then, and so the catchphrase in 1996 is not going to be "it's the culture, stupid." I don't know what it's going to be, frankly. It's going to be, oh, gosh. It's going to be, anyway. but that's another story which I'm not going to get off into. Since the 1970s and 80s, or rather since the 1970s and the 1980s, both of these great forces have run into stone walls. And I used the image of the stone wall rather literally in one case. I don't have to go into great detail about what happened to the economy finally in the early 1990s, particularly 1991. The first that I realized that something was happening is when I began to hear these investment banker jokes. The investment bankers, if I may be so brazen as to use the phrase, had really been thought of themselves as the masters of the universe in the 1980s. Suddenly you started hearing investment banker jokes, and when you start hearing things like, you know, the end is near for the mighty. Two of my favorites were, one was, if you see a dead dog and a dead investment banker on the highway, lying dead on the highway, how do you tell the difference? Well, there's skid marks in front of the dog. It's kind of a rural joke. You have to kind of think about it a while. The other was, one day a blind rabbit and a blind snake collided in the forest. Both of them are startled, have no idea what's happened. The snake says, wait a second, don't move. I'm going to run my tongue over you and try to figure out what you are. So he runs his tongue all over the rabbit. He says, you're round, you're kind of soft, you got big long ears, you got a little twitchy nose. You must be a rabbit. Rabbit said, that's right, now you hold still, I'm going to run my paw over you. So he runs his paw up and down the snake. He says, you're cold, you're slimy, you got great big fangs and no balls. You must be an investment banker. Now, I do not make these things up. I record them. I'm a chronicler. Anyway, I knew the end was near. Now, the other, this great intellectual thrust, the great intellectual force in this country also hit a stone wall in the late 1980s. I predict that in the 21st century, which is just a couple of sighs and gasps away, that the date November 9th, 1989 will be one of those dates that school children are forced to memorize, along with 1066 and 1492 and 1776 and all the rest of them. That, of course, was the date of the breaching of the Berlin Wall, which symbolized in an absolutely unmistakable way the triumph of the United States and the West in the battle against communism, monolithic socialism, whatever you might want to call it. And I think that quite in addition to the obvious political and economic impact of that collapse of the Soviet Empire, there's also been a wind coming through the breach in that wall, which in time, in a few years, will blow away that Marxist mist that Jean-Francois Revel talked about. I mean, already it is rather impossible to be a Marxist any longer. I mean, to be a Marxist today is to be a reactionary. I mean, what is a reactionary? A reactionary is someone who clings desperately to the outmoded, discredited, and exhausted ideas of the past. But as and we also are living in a period when people all over the Eastern Bloc, what used to be the Eastern Bloc of the Soviet Union, are now looking to this country. I find it so interesting to talk to intellectuals or students from Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, Romania, any of those countries, and see the fervid interest, in many cases the passion with which they look at our own history. The passion with which they can recall the words of Thomas Paine and Thomas Jefferson, or George Washington, or even the Federalist Papers. I mean, do you remember trying to wade through the Federalist Papers as you were an American student? And to see the passion that such things inspire is to realize the fervor with which people all over this world, even I submit in many corners of the nations of Islam, are looking. They are looking for guidance, not only in the writing of constitutions and in the conduct of political life, but also in the day-to-day operations of the kind of democratic freedoms of a country like this. And they look for people to tell them how to do it. And I'm afraid that what they get in answer as they look to us is pretty much that hollow silence that Thomas Mann was talking about so many years ago. After all, our intellectuals are caught caught out in a stance of skepticism, perhaps nihilism, often contempt, that makes it pretty much impossible for them to suddenly turn around and try to explain the benefits, the glories, the techniques of democracy that these people are looking for. Our business leaders are no better. When is the last time you've heard an American business leader get up on his two hind feet and really urge anything of a political or moral sort in American life? I think you really go from 1914 to 1992 before you find any American business leader who has done this. In 1914, Henry Ford organized the Ford Peace Ship to go to Europe and to try to settle the mess in Europe on the eve of the First World War. You go from there to 1992 to the strange figure of Ross Perot. Ross Perot suddenly stood up and said, "We know how to do things in American business. You roll up your sleeves, you don't go do a whole lot of agitating about it. You get things done. You just do it directly, you get it done, use common sense." Of course, the machine arrived with no batteries included and a lot of assembly necessary. But nevertheless, I was transfixed by just the sight of a businessman doing this in American life. What about the philosophy departments of the great universities? I'm afraid what you find, not at Brown's different, but at other places you find, up until very recently, you'd find the philosophy departments where you ordinarily would go on to find a Nietzsche for the New Age, a John Stuart Mill, a Hegel of the New Age, people who were concerned with God, freedom, and immortality, as Kant said were the great concerns of philosophy. You find instead mainly two groups, the structuralists and the deconstructionists. By day, the structuralists constructed the structure of meaning and the meaning of structure. By night, the deconstructionists deconstructed the structure of meaning and the meaning of structure. At dawn, the structuralists rose up again and recreated the entire edifice. In the meantime, the would-be Kants, Nietzsche's, of David Hume's were looked upon with contempt as idealists. That was a term of opprobrium. Recently, that has changed, and we are now, and I think it's the most exciting and at the same time discouraging points in academic philosophy in probably of all time. I see young philosophers turning in droves now to the neurosciences. The neurosciences, genetic biology, sociobiology, and the rest, give the promise of defining in precise biological scientific terms what we have always thought of as the human soul or the mind. Or the psyche. And the feeling among young philosophers is, why get mired in a lot of verbiage and kind of rhetorical taffy pulling when the answers in a scientific sense are right there? There is a new Darwin in this country, a Darwin for the 21st century, and I'm not exaggerating. His name is Edward O. Wilson. He's a zoologist at Harvard. He's famous for two books, The Insect Society and Sociobiology, The New Synthesis. His impact on American intellectual life and eventually political life is going to be extraordinary. His view of life, and I'm greatly oversimplifying, but we don't have time to get into this in any great detail. I'm not sure I'm even capable of it, but it's summed up by a statement of his. He said, "We are all born exposed negatives, like the negatives in the camera." He said those negatives can be developed well or they can be developed poorly. But no matter how you develop them, all you're going to get is what is on that negative. That's another way of saying we're all genetically wired. And that's the great lessons of SAT test today, isn't it? Some people are wired right and they get into Brown. Some people aren't. There's really nothing that you can do about it. Sociobiology, neuroscience, as is more commonly termed, is the great intellectual battleground of our times. Are there any freshmen in the audience who really cannot decide what area to major in? I strongly urge neuroscience. It's exciting. It's hot. It's right on the cutting. It really is right on the cutting edge. I know you're not so major bound here, but nevertheless, it's something to shoot for. Is that true, Vartan? I'm not sure. It is the great intellectual battleground for both liberals against conservatives. On the liberal side, there is the recent discovery of what seems to be the gay gene. You know, if there is a gene that predisposes the human species to homosexuality, that changes the attitudes in all sorts of profound ways. At the same time, conservatives are seizing upon studies that indicate that because of the evolutionary developments of the last, say, 300 million years, women are simply wired differently from men for all sorts of tasks. This got Edward O. Wilson himself into a lot of trouble. Wilson is in his personal life very much a liberal. He's very much an environmentalist. He's gone to great lengths to champion that cause. But he happened to say once, you know, I wish feminists well. They have justice and in many ways common sense on their side. He says, but unfortunately 300 million years of evolution militate against their being equal in so many areas. For his pains, a group of protesters broke into a conference here in New England and dumped a bucket of ice water on his head and started chanting, "You're all wet. You're..." I mean, this is a battleground. As I say, it's exciting. I think I would be strongly tempted to go into that if I were an undergraduate today. At the same time, there's something profoundly depressing about this idea that we're all exposed negatives that cannot really be altered very much. The underlying lesson of the neurosciences is that the fix is in. The fix is in genetically. And you can struggle all you want, and you can't change it. Wilson and many others would even argue that your moral sense is also wired in. The fellow feeling that most people feel for small children is wired in. So many things are wired in. That's why there's been such a great interest in the past 5 years in this thing known as attention deficit disorder. So many parents now believe, well, my son, my daughter just can't do well in school. My son, my daughter has ADD. Wired bad. Just wired bad. So often, you ask the same parent, well, does your daughter like Nintendo? Oh, loves it. Watch it all? Well, 4 and 5 hours at a time. You know, this is not attention deficit. This is someone who needs a camp counselor to give a good kick in the slats. But when you feel, you know, that the fix is in, that is what happened. As a result of all of this, let me conclude. We are in a period now in the 1990s that I think of as a period of moral fever. The tide of cynicism, skepticism has been so strong for so many years, and you can see it in movies, our very best literature. You can see it everywhere. The tide has been so strong that there are now millions of people hungering for some kind of moral certitude, just as Nietzsche predicted they would. There's the fastest growing religion in this country among young people is the Pentecostal religion. This is tub-thumping Christianity, ecstatic religion. The other people are turning to brand new religions based on all sorts of new wave things, such as channeling and whatnot. Others, as I mentioned at the very outset, turn to art as a source of spirituality. You may recall recently the Alm Shenrikyo cult, as it's called. All unsuccessful religions are called cults, by the way. The Alm Shenrikyo cult in Tokyo, which is blamed for the poison gas attacks on the Tokyo subway system, turned out to be not made up of marginal malcontents, but had a surprisingly high percentage of graduates of the University of Tokyo. And if you know anything about Japan, the University of Tokyo is Brown, Harvard, Yale, Princeton, and Stanford all rolled into one institution. These are young, well-educated, highly intelligent people looking for some kind of codes, spiritual values, some kind of certitude. Which leads me to Nietzsche's final predictions. Nietzsche predicted, imagine, 1888, that after the catastrophic wars of the 20th century, wars such as never have been waged on Earth before, would come the period of what he called the revaluation, by which he meant the search for new values to replace the osteoporotic skeleton of the old. He said, mankind will limp through the 20th century with the vestigial values left over, this osteoporotic skeleton left over from the 19th century. But towards the end of the century, we'll just run out. You can't keep that skeleton marching forward any longer. Now comes the desperate search for new systems of values to take the place. He said, but this search is doomed. He said, you can believe in nothing without also believing that there is some force in the world that can point toward you and say, thou shalt, and thou shalt not, and you will believe and obey. And of course, that is the one who has been slain. That, of course, is God. And he said that we are heading so rapidly at the end of the 20th, this is a prediction in 1888, we're heading so rapidly at the end of the 20th century toward the eclipse of all values. And he said, where we have lived, no one will be able to live again. And he predicted that in the 21st century, this total eclipse of values, in which it's no longer possible to believe in anything, would be more horrifying than the total wars of the 20th century. And he said, don't deceive yourself. Don't think that science is going to save you. And I think most of, including me, we kind of figure, well, science somehow is going to save us. Even if we don't have these beliefs to guide us, science will show us what works and what doesn't work. This was Nietzsche's final prediction. He said, in the 21st century, science will turn against itself. Science will demolish its own underpinning. He said the nihilism, the skepticism will become so strong that it will devour its own skeleton, its own structure. It has already begun. That's at the Santa Fe Institute, which specializes in kind of the macro understanding of the human animal. It tries to draw together philosophy, sociobiology, neuroscience, all of these great currents in contemporary intellectual life, and discuss them. Had a conference on which was called the Limits of the Scientific Method. The consensus of that conference was and a lot of computer scientists there also, the human brain is too limited for us ever to understand human life. It is, after all, the human brain is a computer. The human brain is not something God put inside of you that you may think, which somebody may have thought 100 years ago. The human brain is a computer. And one of them said, it's as if a group of dogs got together and had a conference on understanding the dog. Said they could work as hard as they wanted, and they'd never get anywhere. He said, you know, they can only communicate about 40 things. They can't record anything. If they could even do an experiment, they couldn't write it down, what had happened. He said, we are no better. We are smarter than the dog, but we're not as smart as we think as we think we are. It's doomed. I was talking just the other day to a geologist in California who said, I went into geology, into the sciences, with hope that you would not imagine. She said, I assumed that first science lays down a very careful layer of brick. More scientists come along, they put down another layer. It's all very carefully done. Occasionally someone tries to build a tower. And the tower's off-center. It doesn't work. So you tear that down. You get back to laying more careful layers of brick. And you finally arrive at a higher and higher and higher knowledge of the earth in the case of geology, of the human soul or psyche in the case of psychology and other sciences. She said, but we are now beginning to realize that all of these edifices of brick are balanced on top of bubbles. There's the Darwinian bubble, she said. There's the Newtonian bubble. There's the Freudian bubble. We've already popped the Freudian bubble. In France, there are very serious scholars, not creationists by any means, who are busy trying to demolish the Darwinian bubble. And imagine if Darwin goes. Imagine the amount of contemporary thought that would go with it. There, the orgy of nihilism that Nietzsche warned of has occurred. So finally, just let me say, here we are at what, in objective terms, is a great moment in the history of a nation. We are the lone superpower. We are on the verge of what could very well be a Pax Americana, a peace that could last 1,000 years. There was a famous Pax Romana, which lasted for about 600 years, when Rome was the only superpower in Western civilization. The Romans ruled by terror. The Roman legions were hated and feared everywhere they went. This country, oddly enough, is not hated in many parts of the world. In the nations of Islam, perhaps. Probably not as much there as we might think. I've noticed that even French intellectuals have stopped carping about American civilization, which is, I think, a very significant sign in itself. In any case, it is certainly a good moment in the life of a nation, any nation, historically. But we are left with a troubling question, which was put best, and I will end with this final vignette, by a Zen abbot from Kyoto, Japan. Time magazine has a custom of editorial lunches to which distinguished individuals from many different walks of life are invited, and the editorial board of Time attempts to sort of pick the brains of these people, see what they're thinking about. The guest at this time was the aforesaid Zen abbot. The abbot was a small man who wore black robes, which made him seem even smaller. Time magazine has always had the capacity to somehow people its editorial board with great trenchermen, people who look like they've all had 2 lunches at the oyster bar and washed it down with a flagon of Pilsner. This was not the current board, incidentally, but not very long ago. So anyway, at the end of the lunch, the editor of Time turns to the Zen abbot and he says, "Well, are there any questions that you would like to ask us about our magazine?" And the abbot says, "Yes, there's one. Why do you publish it?" At this point, as it was described to me by a gentleman who was there was an interval that seemed 7 or 8 minutes long, in which the editors of Time turned, they were like their heads oscillating like summer fans. Finally, the editor pulled himself together, and he used a technique which I recommend to anyone when backed into a corner like this. He used the old imaginary snowball technique. He said, "Well, we feel that it is our duty to keep our readers informed of major historical events and trends. Well, in short, we do it for the benefit of our readers." And to which the Zen abbot said, "Yes, but for the benefit of what?" At this point, it was described to me, the lunch came to a stone-cold end, and everyone went his or her separate way. But the Zen abbot had put his finger on the question that now dogs us as we head into the 21st century. We are in a marvelous position as a nation. We are certainly in a good position. But the question that we are so far unable to answer is, yes, but good for what? And if there's anyone in this audience tonight, why shouldn't there be, who is able to come up with the higher synthesis that will solve this question and lead us to a higher plateau, believe me, you will not only earn the gratitude of mankind, you will light up the sky, lead the world into the 21st century, and be remembered forever. Please go to it, and thank you very much for having me. Thank you, BRIGHTON.
Tom Wolfe's upcoming novel, The Mayflies, will be published sometime next year. In a minute, publisher Judith Regan shares stories of working with Rush Limbaugh, Howard Stern, Christopher Darden, and others. Here are where some authors will be appearing during the coming weeks. On Thursday, military historian John Keegan reads from his new book, Fields of Battle, The Wars of North America, at the Tattered Cover Book.
The First World War, when he wrote Babbitt, when he wrote Main Street, Elma Gantry. Our 5th Nobel laureate for literature, John Steinbeck, was trying to do the same thing about the Great Depression when he wrote The Grapes of Wrath. But in our own time, and really ever since the Second World War, writers have pretty much given up this particular task, not just in the United States, but all across Europe. In the United States, I think the situation was best summed up by Philip Roth at a time when he was the hottest young novelist in America. He had won the National Book Award with Goodbye Columbus. He then lit up the sky with Portnoy's Complaint. And he says, we now live in an age in which the imagination of the novelist is helpless before what he knows he's going to read in tomorrow morning's newspaper. And I think anybody, writer or otherwise, can sympathize with that. I mean, for example, just think of the following little political drama, which 5 years ago could not have been written as fiction. The problem with fiction, I can tell you, having written nonfiction most of my life and then turned to fiction, the problem with fiction is it has to be plausible. That's not true with nonfiction. It's really not true. But fiction has to be plausible. All right, so I'm saying that, 5 years ago, this would not have been plausible. Recently in New York City, there was a primary election, Democratic primary election for city council in the Greenwich Village area of New York. As I say, this little piece of political history is unimportant in itself, but it, I think, dramatizes what I'm talking about. One of the main candidates was the 39-year-old daughter of a famous former New York Congresswoman, Bella Abzug. And when she announced her candidacy, the daughter, for this position, the major plank
to honor us by giving this evening's lecture. Ladies and gentlemen, the wonderful Tom Wolfe.
Barton, thank you very, very much. After that, I should do the decent thing and just retire right now. I mean, it's not going to get any better. One thing I can't forgive Brown University for is luring Barton and Claire away from New York City. The moment they left, the vibrancy, the brilliance, and the general panache of New York dimmed down greatly. So please come back every now and then to poor old Gotham and give us a little illumination. I'm a little embarrassed by the title of my talk for this evening. I saw it was printed on the sort of advance publicity, the end of the century and the spirit of the age. I kind of remind myself of Sigourney Weaver, who gave the commencement address at my daughter's school in New York. It's an all-girls school. And she said, when I arrived here this morning, my intention was to talk to you girls about boys. She said, but the headmistress informs me I have only 15 minutes. So instead, I'm going to tell you the meaning of life. And well, in this case, I feel so ebullient being here in such grand company, and having had a marvelous serving of mashed potatoes at the President's house tonight. I'm going to, in the short time that I have with you, tell you everything that you need to know about the end of the century and the spirit of the age. Now, this term. The spirit
entertainer, he has collected awards, bestowed awards upon him from Columbia, the Washington Newspaper Guild, the Society of Magazine Writers, the American Academy of Arts and Letters, the National Culture Society, and many, 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 many others, including plethora of honorary degrees and the John Dos Passos Award. His literary works frequently sport eclectic titles, like the candy-colored tangerine, flake streamline baby in 1965, and radical chic and Maoing, the flag catchers in 1970, the right stuff in 1979, won the American Book Award, and his 1987 book, Bonfire of the Vanities, was on the bestseller list for months, praised for his deadly wit and engaging style. Tom Wolfe I can describe in the following terms. Number one, he's an intellectual, he's a scholar, he's a writer, he's a journalist, but he's a man of integrity, intellectual integrity, and passion. It has been my great honor and delight to have known him since my Texas days and to have welcomed him as a trustee of the New York Public Library, as a literary lion of the New York Public Library, and as a personal friend. And for every cause that I've asked him to appear for, he's done so, against censorship, on behalf of First Amendment, on behalf of rights of intellectuals to write and writers to disseminate their writings, but more so also on behalf of the book, the libraries. He's a trustee of the New York Public Library. It's been therefore my great privilege that he's taken time off from his book to come all the way from New York to Providence.
The age was actually coined by Hegel in the year 1808, I believe. He called it the zeitgeist, a famous term in its own right. John Stuart Mill brought it forth into the 19th century as the spirit of the age in English. And the idea behind this notion of the spirit of the age, which was taken very seriously 100 years ago, was that every age, every historical epoch has its own moral tone, and that no matter how hard you try, you cannot escape the moral tone of the age that you're in. Now, this idea was once the animating force behind major novelists. The great ones took it as part of their natural task to explain the spirit of the age in which they wrote. An excellent example is Thomas Mann in The Magic Mountain. In the first chapter, he introduces us to his main character, Hans Castorp. He's this good-looking, young, well-educated, well-born young man with the world lying before him. In the second chapter, he suddenly turns to us, the readers, and he says, you know, this man I just introduced you to, this Hans Castorp, he's actually a very mediocre fellow. That it's not that he doesn't have a lot going for him, it's not that he doesn't have a great potential, but he happens to live in an age in which, when one asks the question, why? What are we struggling towards? What is this all about? The answer he gets is only a hollow silence. And it is when you live in an epoch like that, it undercuts your morale. It undercuts your potential, so that someone who should end up having a brilliant career ends up as a mediocre man like Hans Castorp. Well, many great American writers have also taken it upon themselves to try to explain the spirit of the age. Our first Nobel Prize winner in literature, Sinclair Lewis, was attempting to explain the spirit of the age in America right after.
About to publish at 12th, a novel titled The Mayflies.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's my distinguished honor and privilege to introduce this evening Thomas Kennerly Wolfe. Thomas Kennerly Wolfe Jr., to be correct, who broke into the American literary scene in the 1960s, and nothing in fiction has been the same since. Tom Wolfe grew up in Richmond, Virginia, and is a graduate of Washington and Lee University. He has his PhD in American civilization from another respectable institution, Yale University, where the Alumni Association has awarded him the Wilbur Cross Medal. Frequently garbed in white, like a figure from F. Scott Fitzgerald novel, he has carved a unique path in journalism, art, his own art, and fiction. When Tom had to postpone my invitation to be at Brown from last year to this spring, he sent along with his apologia a wonderful line drawing of himself in stocks. It's a collector's item. I'm not going to collect all his letters, I have many of them, for a David Winston Bell Gallery show, because it would not do justice to him, because he is so wonderful. Dubbed the father of new journalism by unknown individuals, not himself, Tom Wolfe has been hailed as the most brilliant chronicler of contemporary American social scene by critics and fans alike. A superb prose stylist, storyteller, and entertainer.